Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, good morning. Thank you for coming for this press conference of the American Muslim Council. It is our pleasure to have you here and our distinguished panelists. My name is Abdurrahman Al-Amoudi. I am the Executive Director of the American Muslim Council here in Washington, D.C. I would like to name this press conference Algeria and Democracy. We in the American Muslim Council, as in the Islamic Salvation Front in Algeria, disciplined ourselves not to have this press conference but a day after what was supposed to be the day after the second round of elections. Today we would have hoped that the Algerian people would have rejoiced on completing their 4-year struggle for democracy, for choice, and for voting in or out whoever they want to rule in Algeria. But as many predicted, and as Dr. Suleiman Young here predicted a few months ago when the American Muslim Council had their conference called Democracy and Human Rights in North Africa, and he will tell us about that, many people predicted that democracy might not live long in Algeria. The Algerian people spoke, and they said and made their choice. It is very unfortunate that the media in the West tried to stereotype the issue of democracy and Islam, not only in Algeria, but worldwide. Although the Algerian people chose their choice, like the people of Russia, like the people of the previous Soviet Union, like the people of East Europe, but unfortunately, Muslim countries still don't get to go ahead with their dreams and their democracy. We even saw it in our own Department of State, where they came up with 2 statements. The first one was a negative one. The second one was a neutral one. It wasn't pro-democracy. It wasn't pro the people, but sometimes also it went far enough to find some reason, constitutional reasons, for the junta which took power in Algeria. In Algeria now, we have a new president by the name of Mohamed, who wasn't in Algeria for the last 30 years, and he is coming in to help the junta rule. We have never seen somebody coming from outside who was a warrior before. Yes, he was. He has his history, but he has been out from the country. The Algerian people struggled for this to happen, but unfortunately, as I said, everybody wants the junta to rule and not democracy. Our session will start today. We will start by a briefing from each of our panelists for a few minutes, and then I will open for discussion. We will start with Dr. Luis Cantori, Professor of Political Science from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County campus. Professor Cantori.
Thank you. It gives me great pleasure to be here this morning to speak on this important subject. I want to begin by saying something further about myself. I am a Middle East specialist. I have spent 25 years now trying to understand Islam. I am not a Muslim, and I just want to say that. What I want to do is I want to talk about 2 factors that are involved in the effort to try to interpret the political situation in Algeria. And basically this has to do with stereotyping. The stereotyping of Islam on the one hand and the stereotyping of Arabs and democracy on the other. And I want to make an argument about the fact that this stereotyping is interfering in a very major way with, in fact, telling the story accurately and analyzing it accurately. One of the conclusions that I want to come to is the following, and that is that if we read the story, if we read the reporting that we're getting, I think it's fair to say the story is basically negative, when in fact the opposite conclusion is the one that's warranted, and that is that it's in fact quite a positive development. But what I want to argue is that the negative conclusion as a result of the stereotypes themselves Now, this is a big subject to talk about stereotypes, but I think there's a very easy way to get into it. And that is, I think, the reoccurring word in the Western accounts of the political situation in Algeria is something called fundamentalism. And that word, the word fundamentalism is in fact a Western stereotype that really has little or nothing to do with Islam in a very important way. The word fundamentalism has come from the English language to be applied to the Arab Middle East and Islam from, in fact, Christianity. The term actually, if it has any meaning at all, it has to do with evangelical Christianity and has nothing to do with Islam. Arabs and Muslims themselves don't even use the word. There is a word, usuliya, in Arabic, but it's not used. It's not an important a term for self-characterization. Instead, what the term becomes is a kind of broad brush concept that is used by the West when it wants to talk about political Islam in order to dismiss it. Because the term has connotations of violence, fanaticism, irrationality, and so forth and so on. And it's striking that in this particular story, the story of the National Salvation Front in Algeria, that this term is the one that is used all the time by both the French press and by the English press to characterize this movement. Because that term fundamentalism also has another connotation to it. And that is that it's a term that somehow is meant to characterize Islamic behavior at the margins. It's supposed to mean something about Islam in its extreme forms. And what we have today in Algeria is not Islam at the margins, but Islam at the center. It's the majority speaking, and it's the majority that's trying to express itself. So what the word fundamentalism becomes in journalistic terms and in policy terms, as used in American policy statements, is a term of dismissal. It means that whatever point of view, whatever political agenda that the majority of the Algerian people, as determined by one of the freest elections, in fact, that have occurred anywhere in the Middle East, has to say is not acceptable. It's very interesting because the press reporting is, after all, supposed to be objective. In fact, it's not, because it uses this particular term. The second stereotype has to do with the whole subject of democracy. And here, the stereotype is essentially the following, and that is that one cannot, quote unquote, reasonably speak about a democracy in the Middle East. That's considered a kind of an oxymoron. It's a kind of a contradiction. First of all, it overlooks, that stereotype overlooks some pretty remarkable things that have happened on the subject of Islam and democracy in at least two countries. And that's got to do with the participation of the Muslim Brethren, or the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, in parliamentary politics in Egypt, for example. And it also overlooks the fact that the Speaker of the Parliament in Jordan is a member of an Islamic organization. And that in Jordan, the Muslim organization, the Ikhwan, has in fact participated in the parliamentary process. Now, with what outcomes is another question. But the point is that we lose sight of the fact that there's already been a recent experience along these lines. But I think that the thing that's really lost sight of, and this is a kind of a conclusion that I would make about this, is the fact that what we have in Algeria today is provincial elections that resulted in a major political success for the FACE, conducted in a very fair and very regular fashion. And then we have had the first stage of parliamentary elections, which have occurred in the same way. And these kinds of elections, on the basis of this regularity and this degree of representativeness, in fact, has not occurred anywhere else in the Middle East. And that's the story. So it's not a negative story. If you're a Democrat with a small d and one wants to see democracy in the world, it's in fact a positive story. It's a wonderful accomplishment and something to be looked at in a constructive way. But the stereotype interferes, because the stereotype assumes that Muslims batter their way to power, that they fight their way to power. And all of a sudden, the Western press is disappointed because the Muslims in Algeria are not doing that. They are conducting themselves according to the law and the Constitution in a democratic fashion. So what the Western press then does is say the following: well, we're kind of disappointed. You understand I'm speaking in a slightly provocative way, but the Western press is kind of disappointed because the Muslims are not behaving irrationally and in an extreme way. But the Western press also knows that democracy is incompatible with Islam. And therefore, if the Muslims are going to conduct themselves according to the law and in a constitutional way, well, what can we expect? Because if they should succeed, they will frustrate democracy, and democracy will not happen. Well, at this point, we're getting very dictatorial. We're getting very judgmental about something that we have, in effect, no business being judgmental. This is an Algerian dynamic. This is an Algerian political process. It'll play itself out, I think, in a dialectical way, because there is a tradition of secularism in Algeria. There is exactly that tradition. And there is the Islamic sentiment fueled by grievances and economic disparities and non-performance on the part of the system and so forth and so on. That's an Algerian case, an Algerian situation. It's a very dramatic one. Furthermore, we need to realize, and that is the extreme discipline and order with which the FIS has conducted itself. And then if we finally come to where I understand we are right now, what we have is even a more positive story. But you see, the press is not reporting it this way. The positive story is the following. The junta has taken power, and the FIS, as the Islamic majority, but now opposition to the junta, has chosen, for the time being at least, to behave in a peaceful and a restrained way. And then what is happening is that the FLN has now joined the FIS in opposition to the junta. Hussein Ahmed, the leader of the Berber-based political opposition group, has joined with FIS. And what we have is a remarkable case of a commitment on the part of groups that really don't agree with one another to commit themselves to a democratic process. And the story is not being told that way. And I would further conclude with the observation that what we're seeing in Algeria right today, in fact, has the prospects of a real prospects of democracy. It has the real prospects of a kind of structured pluralism, in which the FLN, for example, will continue probably to argue a kind of secular point of view, but that will be representative of a certain segment of the Algerian people. And the Ahmed group will represent another kind of ethnic factor, Muslim, but also ethnic in its Berber identification. And then the FIS will represent something else. And so the story is really a remarkably positive one. And I would conclude by observing the fact that it's not told that way. It's taken to be a negative one. And I would suggest that it's a consequence of these stereotypes. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cantori. For the record, I'd like to say that as of now, I have only seen 3 specialists who would come out and talk about this the way they did. And those are Professor Cantori, Professor Antilles from New York, and Mr. Graham Fuller from the RAND Corporation. Thank you very much for clarifying the stereotypes, the issue of Islam and the Islamic movements. And yes, not only the FLN, but also the NLF, the National Liberation Front, now joined FIS into fighting the junta, as the professor said eloquently, in the most positive way, but it is yet to be reported. I would like to introduce Dr. Mohamed Lazzouni, who is also a consultant for AMC. He is a native from Algeria, and he would give us some background on Algeria in the last 4 years. Dr. Lazzouni.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. What I'd like to do for you is maybe to come with two major points. The first one is to put Algeria in the context of the world map. What I'd like you to know is that Algeria has always been a very rich place of cultures and civilizations. It's the second largest country in Africa. It's in a very strategic location for geopolitics in the world. It counts approximately a population of 26 million people. And as any other country around the region on the southern side of the Mediterranean basin, it has, of course, suffered the tragedy of a very brutal and ruthless colonialism, out of which it came in about 1962. And the thing that makes Algeria remarkable is the fact that it bridges three very interesting poles: the one of Islam, the other one of the African world, and the third one of the Arab world. With this, we move to basically 1988, where the action started taking place. After a state of total confusion that brought about the FLN to the point of losing its credibility as the appropriate leadership for the Algerian people, the crumbling infrastructure and the crumbling institutions in Algeria could no longer be sustained by the Algerian people. And then in October '88, the people decided to voice their concern by taking down to the streets. As this happened, their protest was ruthlessly suppressed by the authorities, and the crackdown was one of the bloodiest ones that Algeria had known since its independence in 1962. In trying to absorb people's anger, the government came up with a reform program that had three major points. That the first one, it would move from a one-party rule to a multi-party rule, and then immediately that would be followed by local, legislative, and presidential elections. In about 1989, a myriad of parties appeared, and we counted 50 at the last count, and these parties accounted for a diversity of political forces. The immediate domination became almost that of the Islamic movement that appeared as the movement that had the strongest popular support. By June 1990, the local elections were on schedule, and then, surprisingly enough, the Islamic Salvation Front, known by its initials, the FIS, ended up winning a sweeping victory in the electoral elections. To this victory came two different reactions that we observed in the world. On the one hand, we had the sympathizers to Islamic movements that could not hide their euphoria and were absolutely delighted by what had happened in Algeria, and saw a new glimpse of hope for Islam and the marriage of Islam and democracy overall. And in the second scenario, we have seen chilling reports that try to play a very, very demeaning picture and stereotype as to what is the implication of an Islamic party ruling Algeria. And so the story went on. By May 25th, when the ruling party was preparing the legislative elections, the Islamic Front immediately realized that the electoral laws were tampered with and were certainly unfair as a platform for elections. In an attempt to convince the government by peaceful means to come back on the decisions made on the electoral laws, the FIS completely failed in doing so and moved towards a new move by asking people to call for a general strike. The response was overwhelming, and between May 25th and June 7th, basically the country was paralyzed by a general strike. The response to this strike was again another crackdown of a more bloody nature than the first one. That crackdown then brought some more anger from people on the ruling party, which decided to take a new stand. The first one by dismissing completely the Hamrouche government that was at the time ruling the country, and secondly by bringing in reforms to the laws that were unfair and were introduced. Then an emergency state was imposed, and then the reforms that were promised were implemented. And so people hit their campaign trail, and by December 26th, we come to basically the parliamentary elections that have become very famous by now. And in December 26th, when people went to the polling stations and chose what they wanted to be the party that governs them, they ended up choosing the FIS as being the ruling party. By choosing the FIS as being at least the ruling majority, by choosing the FIS as and giving it its majority, the euphoria that took people was the most exciting experience that Algerian politics and Algerian people knew since the independence in 1962. Just at the peak of the euphoria, the president of Algeria decides to resign, and after the resignation of the president of Algeria, the whole country ended up being in a shell-shocked state from which people are trying to recover to this very day. I would like to stop at this point, and the story will be picked up beyond this by my colleague. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lazzouni. I would also present now Dr. Mohamed Esseghir. He is another consultant of AMC coming from New York, and is also a native of Algeria. Dr. Esseghir would tell us and pick up from when Dr. Lazzouni stopped. تفضل.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم. Indeed, we are happy that the AMC is conducting this program, because it is important to know what is happening. And it is really sad news that instead of declaring and announcing the popular will of an entire population with its history, we are here to tell you the sad news that a military junta has taken over and stopped a process that has been gladly started. When the 1989 constitution was submitted to referendum and the Algerian people have adopted that constitution, it was understood at that point that that constitution will be the rule of the game, which means whoever party accepted that constitution will have to abide by it. And such is the case of the Islamic Salvation Front. So it entered the political arena of the Algerian scene under that election, and that's how it was accepted. After that, things became sour, because it was accepted in the thinking of the ruling regime, the National Liberation Front, that it does not have the population, the support that will make an enigma later. So, as my colleague has stated, we have the presidency, the precedent of the local elections in which the FIS took a majority, and against all the problems, against all the roadblocks that were engineered against the FIS, against the performance of the FIS also. Because I have to state here that contrary to what is reported of the poor performance of the FIS at the local level, that was not the case. We have budgetary cuts, we have the power of the local councils that were removed by the regime, so that to make sure that the FIS will fail, and to make it basically to face the population with all its problems, but at the same time not being able to deliver anything. And the scheme was that it will fail. And so when parliamentary elections come in, people will not take this party seriously. It is a party of fiery speeches and slogans and all that. That's how it was reported. But indeed, the FIS was able to clean the rusty machine, was able to run it as efficiently as possible under the circumstances, was able to clean the bureaucracy, was able to clean the corruption, at least at the local level. And that's why the people have rallied around the FIS. What we got on December 26 is not a result from the void. So other roadblocks have to be built after the failure of the first scheme. One of them consisted in the promulgation of an electoral law that was so unjust and so obvious that it favored the ruling party and make sure that it will remain in power no matter what the popular will is. So we have provinces in which the FLN is major or has some kind of strongholds. The seats have been multiplied. In other parts of the country, like major cities, like the capital where 3.5 million voters, the seats have been reduced, and the story goes on. Still, the FIS has taken a stand in which it is within the constitution and within the rule of the games. And this position emanates from its Islamic behavior, that we have to stand by our words. That led to the confrontation of May and June, in which we know the results and the leaders were jailed. Then, after the law was a little bit altered, we have the elections of December 26, and the results came in. Before the results, however, the regime took pride in itself for running a democratic and clean elections. And we are told that the transparency of the elections, as they called it, was symbolized by the see-through glass boxes that were used during the election day. At the end of the election day, people were told, and we are congratulated for their political maturity. No report of fraud whatsoever, no report of misbehavior whatsoever, but the mood has changed as soon as the numbers started rolling in. And when it became clear to where the numbers are leading to, then sourness became obvious. And we have the story of the recalls. Starting by the ruling party and others, the recalls start rolling in, to the point at which it almost has taken all the seats that have been decided on. Still, with these provocations, the FIS leadership has stood by the game and said, look, if this is the case, it's okay with us. We are not going to get to the streets. We will accept whatever verdict this Constitutional Council that was supposed to pronounce the final word is going to come. The FIS position was that even if the entirety of the seats are abolished, we will continue and take them the next round, as long as it is fair. So this is the position. Meanwhile, President Ben Jadid was negotiating behind the scene with the FIS leadership to find out a way in which they can cohabit, as the French they call it, la cohabitation, which means they can rule together. The FIS was not pushing for an ousting of Shedley whatsoever, and it is documented in its pronouncements. So apparently Ben Jadid has got some kind of an agreement with them, but when he went to the army and presented the plan, the army told him, we think you went too far, and it's time for you to step down. So this is the surprise of January 11. After Ben Jadid stepped down, we are told also, and never before, that the National Assembly was also dissolved the week before, which means it's a constitutional void, or a state of exception, as they want to say, to call it. A state of exception that brought army officers and obviously the chief of staff, the defense minister, and with a small makeup of civilian figures like the prime minister, who before has claimed that he will run and take pride in clean and democratic process. So we have this parade of councils that have taken place, 3 or 4 of them since then, and after that we see them changing every day, the heads and the names and the figures. And lately they have blended what they call a collegial presidency, which means a presidency that is composed of several members, obviously the chief of staff and the defense minister, a human rights minister, justice minister, secretary of the veterans of the war, and a figure that was imported from a Moroccan, across the Moroccan border. This is not to decrease from the personality of Mr. Mohamed Boudiaf, because he is really a revolutionary founder. He did what he could do at his time. He has been away from the Algerian political scene for 27 years. And as such, he is not apt to the present situation. Moreover, we are brought also another figure, supposedly religious figure from the Paris mosque, in order to give it again a religious flavor to appease the population instead of the feast. All this blending is not acceptable. Number one, it is not constitutional. Boudiaf has no legitimacy, and nobody has the power to bring anybody to rule, because the people have spoken. And if we accept anybody else, means we are telling the people that the entire thing is a joke. And we cannot say this to the people. I will further state that this council has no future. Nobody is obeying it. And as the professor before me has stated, we have a coalition. It's not a problem of the FIS. It is not a party that is at stake. It is the will of the people. And that's why we have the bitter enemy of the FIS, the FLN, came 2 days ago and joined hands. We have the FFS, which is the Front of Socialist Forces, which is another bitter enemy of the FIS, which used just a few days ago in a rally in Algerie saying that we are between the regime of the police state and the integrist state, or the fundamentalist state, and we are in between. Here it is now joining. So we have this beautiful picture of the real representative of the Algerian people getting together and standing in front of this military junta. I think I have to stop here, and maybe during the question and answers we can elaborate further. But it is really a usurpation of the rights of a people to go and import figures, one from France, one from Morocco, and tell them that they are here to lead you. We are joking. Out of the 188 seats won by the FIS, 171 representative to the parliaments are Ph.D. holders. This is an insult to the people, to those representatives, and I would say further, to universities from where they graduated, those people. Thank you very much.
Dr. Esseghir, thank you very much. We now come to Professor Suleiman Yang. Professor Suleiman Yang is in the National Advisory Board of the American Muslim Council. He is also the chair of the African Studies Department in Howard University. Professor Yang.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great opportunity to stand before you to deal with the Algerian problem. I think there are 3 points which I am going to address, which I hope at the end of my presentation will show the nature of the problem in Algeria and the global implications for the Muslim world and for the rest of humanity. First of all, as the 3 previous speakers pointed out, starting with Professor Louis Cantori, Algeria is an important part of Africa, a very strategic area in the Mediterranean, and definitely one of the important countries in the Arab world. Algeria has a very unique and distinct experience as a country in recent times. It was colonized by the French. It was the only part of Africa where the French thought that the country was an extension of France. And the interaction between the Algerian people and the French people was so thorough and so close that many French men and women thought that they were in control of Algeria. And of course, this gave a very dangerous created a dangerous situation in the area. And of course, the 1962 independence of Algeria was won by the Algerians in asserting their unique Algerian identity. And I think that's very important because people who are concerned about the Islamic movement taking power in Algeria tend to see a number of stereotypes which Professor Cantori was talking about. This stereotype of Islam as a violent religion, stereotyping of the Arabs as human beings who are incapable of democratic government. These are prejudices which feed certain elements in Western society because it works in their interest to see to it that democracy is not practiced in the Arab world. And if democracy is not practiced in the Arab world, of course, it justifies their attitude towards the Arabs and the Muslims. And it also works in terms of policies over here, because people who are not democratic are not likely to receive favor. But if the Arabs and the Muslims become democratic, those elements who benefit from the fact that in the Arab world you have dictatorships and tyrants like Saddam Hussein would feel very comfortable. They say, well, you see, we told you, those people are different from us. But as the Algerians demonstrated very clearly, that they are not only people who are very concerned about their cultural identity, but that they are willing to stand by the rules of the democratic game. And of course, the leadership of FIS demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that they were willing to restrain their following so that they went through the local government elections and they were able to win. Now, this is a very important point in the sense that the Algerian situation really is a situation where you have people who are very concerned about their national sovereignty, their cultural integrity, and their self-determination. And of course, in any democratic society, people should be concerned about those three things. People in America are very concerned about that. People in Britain are very concerned about that. People in France are very concerned about that. So if the Algerians express strong interest in maintaining their sovereignty, their cultural integrity, and their own destiny, any Democrat should support them for that reason. This is one point which I think should be made very clear to all of us as we look at the Algerian situation. Second point that needs to be brought out here is the fact that the FIS is not the first Muslim movement that has tried to practice democracy. As Professor Cantori pointed out, in Egypt, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin is part of the democratic political process that is, however imperfect, being attempted in Egypt. You go to Malaysia, you find Muslim groups running for elections, and they are in the government in Malaysia. Of course, you find in sub-Saharan Africa, no political party so far has been allowed to operate on under Islamic banner. But in Senegal and in Nigeria, you do have people who are very committed to Islam who are in the political process. Now, they haven't mobilized themselves under an Islamic banner because at the moment, the governments in that part of Africa are not willing to accept religious political parties. But I'm very sure that if they open up the system, a similar development would happen. So the point I'm making here really is that apart from these stereotypes about fundamentalists, about Islamic extremism that you usually read in the Western media, the fact is that in the Muslim world itself, you do have pockets of democratic practices that exist. What has happened in the Western world is that Western scholars, and Western intellectuals, and Western journalists cheat a great deal when they do these things because they try to point out that in the Muslim world, wherever you may see democracy, such as in Malaysia, in Senegal, or in Gambia, or even now in northern Nigeria as they move towards democratization, is because secularism is the order of the day, and that those are really not Muslims. So the point is this: the purity of Islam cannot go with democracy, which is again not substantiated by evidence. I mean, we have an Algerian situation where the majority of the people have expressed their will. So it is not Islam on the margins, as Professor Cantori was trying to point out. It is Islam in the mainstream. And the majority of the Algerian people have expressed their opinion quite categorically that they want the FIS to rule them. And of course, the decision that has been taken by the military junta demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that these dictators don't want to hand over power. But I will warn them. Dictators ride on tigers, which they dare not dismount, and the tigers are getting on hungry. So that is something that the military junta should recognize. Now, I have made this point before. We had a conference here, on the same building here, a couple of months ago, and I pointed out very clearly that there are certain elements in the West who don't like Muslims, who don't like Arabs, and for a variety of reasons would like to sabotage any kind of democratic experiment in the Muslim world. The Muslims want to govern themselves. They don't want any outsider to govern them. And they want to govern themselves badly. Freedom in danger is better than servitude in tranquility. And this is something that must be categorically clear. The Muslims want to govern themselves. And if we are genuinely interested in the New World Order to establish a human rights system whereby people can fight for the rights of each and every human being in the society, then we have to allow the Muslims to govern themselves. If they are going to govern themselves badly, let them accept the consequences. And I will make the point very clear to FIS leadership and to other Muslim groups around the world. If you are going to operate by democratic rules, you have to take power peacefully and you must yield power peacefully. Now, those who don't want Muslims to take power peacefully, as Kennedy pointed out, if you don't want revolution to happen peacefully in society, you're going to have a violent revolution. And I think this is categorically clear. Policymakers in the West should recognize that fact. You cannot deny Muslims the right to represent themselves. You do it at your own risk. And that is some point that we have to make categorically clear. The Muslim world is 1 billion human beings, and nobody, and I emphasize this, nobody is in a position to keep them in servitude. You do it at your own peril. Third point that needs to be made very clear, and that is, as we move into the 21st century, and as the Muslim societies move rapidly along industrialization, it makes good sense for human beings to recognize each other as equals. And the only way we can do that is through democracy. In the Muslim world, we have tyrannies, and those tyrannies are not going to continue indefinitely. Any Muslim who has any illusion that such tyrannies are going to continue is making a serious mistake. Any policymaker who naively thinks that these dictators can be kept against the will of their people is really living in a dream world. Because the reality in the modern world is that we have been linked together by telecommunication, the fax machine, the telephone, the telex, and the computer are the great conspirators. They make it very difficult for tyrants to govern. And if you're a tyrant, woe unto you, for your days are numbered. And in the Algerian context, I will make it categorically clear that the Algerian people, whether they are Islamists or secularists, will not tolerate tyranny. The FLN has been a dictatorship since independence. They never had elections, free and fair. They declare one-party state like most African dictatorships. Now that they have opened the gates, they are being swept by the flood. And the flood of democracy cannot be stopped. Those of us who are genuinely interested in democracy in America and anywhere else in the world must make it categorically clear that our economic and political interest lies in keeping democracy in Algeria, whether it is under the FIS or any other political party. Thank you.
Professor Nyang, as usual, thank you very much for your eloquent clarifications. I would now open for a dialogue, questions and answers, and I would request that whoever asks a question identify himself and who he represents. Yes.
My name is Yusuf Ibrahim. I'm from Algeria. I'm concerned about the situation in Algeria. I'd like to ask a question to the panelists. Actually, it's a comment that followed by a question. In an attempt to discredit any possible democratic takeover by Muslims in Algeria, the West embarked in a propaganda of warning against a new Iran at the doors of Europe, or that the first Muslim bomb is about to be produced in Algeria. What do you answer to those allegations?
Anybody wants to pick up?
Yeah,
Yes.
I'd like to speak to it in the same way that I made my remarks in the first place, but an extension of it. Political Islam is localized Islam. And that, from an analytical point of view, I think that's the only way to interpret it. In other words, the Islam of Iran in its political manifestation is appropriate or certainly specific to that country. And that is the problem with this word fundamentalism, as I was describing it, because what's in the minds of people is exactly the point you just made, that somehow things that happen in one place are somehow inevitably going to occur in another. And the answer is something very different, and that is that the tradition, for example, of political Islam in Algeria is quite old. I'm thinking of Mesle Hajj and the nationalist movements of the 1930s. So that what we're seeing, what we must do is understand political Islam in Algeria in terms of itself, and be objective about that, and not to cloud the issue by the emotionalism of these stereotypes. As far as the bomb is concerned, that is a very specific question. It's not to be discounted, but I would say that, and I am, as a political analyst of the Middle East, I try to keep track of these things, and to my knowledge, there simply isn't any basis for it. What nations will do is they will try to arm themselves in a way that they think is appropriate in order to pursue their national interest. And Israel, for example, is no different. Iraq was no different. And we can expect Algeria to be no different. Now, whether there's a bomb on the horizon is another whole question. One thing we do know, and that is that weapons proliferation and nuclear and technology proliferation is geometrical. And that is a concern that we all should share, and that is that there's going to be a widespread use of chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, and the technology is just running away at a pace that policymakers just simply aren't taking proper recognition of this. But I would go back to the point that we must analyze Algeria in terms of its own aspirations and its own politics, and not the generalizations of what happens somewhere else is going to occur in Algeria itself.
Thank you, Professor.
I guess I'd like to follow up with an interesting comment concerning the second part of the question, that is the issue of the Islamic bomb. If we were to follow the news carefully, one very interesting idea that arises from reading what gets either written or reported by the media is that this Islamic bomb has changed ethnicity incredibly over the last few years. It started becoming a Pakistani bomb, which was an Islamic one, then ended up becoming an Iranian bomb, then became an Islamic one, then ended up being a Libyan bomb, which then became an Islamic one. And finally, it's an Algerian bomb that is an Islamic one. What I'm going to suggest here is if we just wait a little bit, it might change ethnicity once more, and it might end up somewhere else in the world.
Thank you. Yes.
It's Fareed Newman, Minaret, and Horizons Magazine. When we look at the world scenario, we see that the powers that be have eliminated the military strength of Iran by pitting Iraq against it. And it has then pulled the rug from under Iraq, which eliminates the military powers of the Muslim world. Now we have the scenario of the New World Order and the Islamic presence of influence on its governments. Islam is trying to establish itself in the world as democracy, or this New World Order established itself. So we have the forces of the New World Order and the Islamic presence. How is Algeria play into this scenario, which seems to be a greater conspiracy, and how does, what is the outcome to be? To Dr. Nyang.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I wrote a recent piece on Islam and the New World Order. I think what we can say really is that the architects of the New World Order are concerned about three principles. One is collective security, and of course, President Bush, who first mooted out this New World Order concept at the height of the Gulf crisis, did not elaborate, and we have yet to see really any kind of elaborate analysis or presentation of the New World Order concept. But Krauthammer, one of the writers in the local press here, tries to point out some of the building blocks which went into the New World Order. And of course, he identified three as far as I can remember now. One was the collective security principle, the second was human rights, and then of course the third one is the free market system, privatization of economies globally. Now, if you take these three principles and you apply them to Algeria and to the Muslim world, what you really see is that the Muslims have no problem with collective security. If collective security is practiced as developed during the interwar period, meaning between World War I and World War II. Collective security worked only when the Security Council members worked together. And of course, up until the collapse of the Soviet Empire, you had a problem of getting the two superpowers to agree when it comes to conflict of interest between them. And of course, in the post-Cold War period, what is going to happen really is we have the United States as the dominant power for the time being. And of course, for that reason, you have military hegemony on the part of the United States. Now, policymakers in the United States have to recognize that Muslims are very concerned about human rights. And what they have to do in the Muslim world is to make sure that Muslims and Muslims living in America have a responsibility to make sure that Muslims in the old world, if we had to use that term, are aware of the fact that human rights is a very valued principle, not only by American Muslims, by other Americans, but by all human beings who are really concerned about defending the rights of the individual. So for that reason, in the Algerian context, whether we have a regime on the FIS or whatever political party, human rights become very critical. It's good for the Muslim, so that as a minority political group or a majority political group, their rights are respected. And that's one reason why we're here. We feel that the human rights and the civil rights of the Algerians are being violated right now by a junta that is self-imposed. They have no mandate. They have no basis to govern. So for that reason, the New World Order must be hypocritical if it does not protect the rights of the FIS to govern, because human rights are being violated right now. And I would expect all those groups that are actively involved in human rights to do that. When it comes to the third principle of privatization, the Muslims have no problem with that. What the Muslims don't like to see is that they don't like to see fat cats who are feasting on riba. That has to be thought out carefully by Muslim economists and policymakers. And I'm sure that the FIS had their own intellectuals. I was very impressed by the figures. Over 150 PhDs. That's remarkable. I don't think the British Parliament can compete.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Farid Bernoussi. I'm with the Maghreb Arab Press. Dr. Cantori talked about the fundamentalism in the perceived negatively by the West, generally speaking. I agree with that. But there is another word, which I don't know if it exists in English, which is intégrisme in French, which is widely used by the French. And they seldom use, actually, fundamentalism. But my question is, how do you explain the absenteeism of the majority of the Algerian people who did not go to vote? Because a great majority of the large majority of Algerians didn't go to vote. How do you explain that? And why didn't they cast their votes for the FIS? And the other thing is, I agree with you that the West is doing everything to undermine the efforts made by the FIS and the success by the FIS. However, it gives the impression I get here is that the whole panel gives the impression that it is a problem between the West and the FIS, and as if there is no real democratic process going on in Algeria between Algerian and Algerians.
And I would like to anybody here to answer about the other part of the Algerian people who are in the democratic process. I'm talking about the people, not the army and the rest. Because after all, when we think of it, it is the very FNL that legalized the FIS.
Well, I would, first of all, on the question of terminology, I would suggest that the French term is more analytical and more descriptive of political Islam. And what I mean by that, I'm thinking about this word integral, intégré. And that is that Islam, after all, politically and socially is communitarian. And the ummah, the concept of the ummah and the value of the community. So I think in a certain sense that term is an analytical term and has a certain importance. However, where it breaks down and becomes a kind of a stereotype of its own is the fact that it assumes that there's no room in that ummah for pluralism and for an alternative point of view. So the way the French use that term is the same sense as the word fundamentalism is used by the Anglo-Saxon press, and that is it's a term of dismissal because it means that Muslims can't tolerate pluralism. That's what that French term really means. So I think it's another prejudicial term. As far as the dynamic of politics within Algeria is concerned, at the very end of my remarks, I tried to, in a sense, address the point that you're making. Clearly, there is a difference of opinion about the political opinion about the Algerian political future. And there's no doubt about that. But that is a division that is something that the Algerians themselves will have to work out. Now, as far as the participation, the degree of participation, this is a very interesting comment because it suggests correctly that the Algerian experience with democracy until this moment is imperfect. But you see, the United States of America elects its presidents, Bush and Reagan, on the basis of 26% of the support of those eligible to vote. So we have minority presidents in this country. A profound imperfection, frankly, from my point of view, as an American citizen. I'm always angry about this. So the imperfection of Algeria has its direct counterpart in the great democracy of the United States, and that is just imperfect, and it is something that needs to be addressed and so forth. Now, I think the further aspect of that, I think, is a matter of political mobilization. Often is the case in the political history. When the opportunity came for elections in the present situation in Algeria, those who were organized were the ones who were first off the mark. The ones who had an agenda, who were motivated, and so forth and so on. If democracy, in fact, is going to develop in Algeria, I think what we will see will be a mobilizational process in which other groups will now begin to see the way in which their interests can be represented in the process, and that they therefore will be motivated. So therefore, I think that the non-voting part of that is a residue of the FLN dictatorship, of political passiveness and non-involvement. And so we can anticipate that something different will happen. Yeah.
Yes, he brought up a really interesting question. I would like to correct, however, the term minority voted. I think according to the figures that reached us, it's 58% of the people voted. So I think 58% is quite a good number. This is due, obviously, to many problems. The election, although it was clean and fair, etc., it was not perfect in terms of administratively run. There are many people who did not receive their voting cards. There were many people who were assigned to the wrong voting places. When they went there, they did not find their names listed, etc. And this was, in my perspective, engineered so that to decrease the number of people who will vote for the FIS. For example, I know many families personally in which only the elder woman received the card, while all the other family members did not receive anything. So the old woman was perceived as the one who will not go to vote, but indeed she went. As far as the FIS with this, it has no problem. They could have gone to the second round. They could have convinced people to go to the voting polls and express their voices. We have no problem with that. And actually, it has been exemplified by the present alliance that has emerged after this coup d'etat. So I think if this was really the reason, it should have gone to the second round and everybody should have convinced the Algerians to give their voices rather than let others to do that.
If you don't mind, I'd like to address two quick points. The first one is the issue of what's going on between Algerians and Algerians. There is this idea that floats around that Algeria is divided down the line, exactly in the middle, into secular versus religious. I have yet to see evidence of that because I don't know when I've seen certain references to such an aspect where people got this idea from. Interestingly enough, in the ceremony where Boudiaf assumed the leadership of the council that has put in, he reiterated once more that Islam was the property of everybody and could not be monopolized by somebody. So the division of secular versus religious is something that needs to be thought about very, very carefully. That's on one aspect of things. The second thing is the issue of the of what's going on now is really people rallying for a principle that has to do with the usurpation of power. So the differences have been so far put aside, and people swept them aside purposefully because every one of the people who rallied behind the idea of fighting against the people that imposed themselves did it on the basis of two things. First of all, they know who are the people that have come to power. And secondly, they know that whichever agenda will come from this is certainly not going to be satisfactory and cannot be acceptable. So in other words, the driving motivation behind this goes again once more far beyond the differences that people have. It's interesting though that there are some marginal parties that pledged their support to the newly appointed people or the newly self-appointed people. Now, here is a very, very important issue though that I would like to touch upon. Why is it that we still keep emphasizing on the interaction between the West and the Algerian crisis? I think because there are some very alarming signs. For this, I'm going to quote an article of the New York Times by Thomas Friedman this Sunday, where in the concluding part of the paragraph, he quotes a US policymaker that more or less gives us a flavor as to what we should expect in the future in terms of policy making in this country. That idealism should not be a matter for foreign policy. But what needs to be done is idealism needs to be injected with a dose of realism, as he called it at the time. And that's very, very, very disturbing because a long time ago, I remember at an early age of my life, I read a book by a Muslim thinker by the name of Ali Izetbegovic, a Yugoslav thinker, who gave a very interesting concept that I had enormous problems trying to understand. That he said that one of the major problems with the West, that it sells its ideas, but when it comes to the implementation, it's a different story. And at the time, I was completely baffled by this. Are we seeing this in the making now is a big question. And there is reason for concern here, that if you apply a certain thing, you apply it uniformly across the board when it becomes a matter of principle. And for that reason, Algerians should not be excluded from this sphere.
Well, I'd like to add that Ali Izetbegovic was not only a thinker, but now he is the president of Bosnia and Herzegovina in Yugoslavia. Yes, sir.
My question really is to ask, what is the opinion of the panelists of the effect that the position of the State Department has taken will have on the image of the presidency and the image of the government? As we know, there was this initial acceptance of the military rationale that this was constitutional. Then later, after some pressure from somewhere, this was modified to say, in effect, that we are going to stay out of this, that the U.S. is going to be neutral. Given that type of presentation after all the advocacy for democracy in the Middle East, is it your view that the American people can see the hypocrisy in this, and will this reflect against the administration? And in a political sense, a real political sense, is this position inimical? Is it a bad situation for the U.S. to carry forward?
I think that I think your question is very well poised and right to the point. Clearly, the first response on the part of the White House was their preferred response. I think it was more reflective of their real sentiment. The second response was one of reconsideration, as I understand it, after they conferred with their French allies and European allies on the question of the possible negative consequences of a violent conflict in Algeria, that the worker immigrant population in France would be added to, and this would create domestic complications for France. So therefore, the Americans altered their position to one of quote-unquote neutrality. But as you're pointing out, their neutrality is in fact a prejudice and a statement of hypocrisy. There's nothing more imperfect in certain ways than the so-called democracy of Russia today. I mean, it's just, you know, we can give them their credit and we can cheer them on. But Yeltsin is not a archetypical democratic figure, nor is the political process within Russia that way at all. It's quite imperfect, and it's faltering, and it's stumbling, and it's trying to work on the one hand. On the other hand, there's no absence of approbation on the part of the American government regarding Russia or any of the other tentative efforts at democracy in Eastern Europe. And yet when we turn around to something that I, as a specialist, and I think many specialists would agree, the drama of the democratic opportunity or potential within the Algerian situation, the White House chooses to be silent. Now, they have reasons to be that way, because after all, for the most part, the coalition states in the Gulf War itself, on the American side, were the other way. They are the feudal countries. They are the more restrictive and less democratic countries, and in fact the opposite point is true. And this has been made by myself and others in writing, and that is that when we look at the opposition groupings in the Gulf War, that's where democracy is. The greater factor of democracy is on that side because the leaderships were reflecting popular sentiment in their country in criticizing the American involvement in the Gulf. So I think, as has already been pointed out by my colleague over here, talking about Thomas Friedman's statement and commenting, I think this is what we're looking at. We're looking at hypocrisy, and we're looking at a double standard.
In the polls, would it reflect in the sentiment? That's what I was trying to get.
Well, we are running out of time, and I have 2-3 hands there. Yes. Thank you.
Hassan Ibrahim, I'm a concerned Muslim about the situation in Algeria. And what I can see in part of the negative media about the situation in Algeria, pointing that if the Muslims take the lead, they're going to alter the constitution. And I would like to see your opinion about this alteration. If it's, do you see it as an alteration in the form of amendments like we have here in the US amendments to make it more practical, or are these amendments in the form of we're going to use democracy and the constitution to get to the top, and then we're going to burn that ladder and nobody else will get there?
Thank you.
Yes, this is an interesting one, because that's what we are hearing. If these people get to power, they will stop the democratic process anyway, so why should we let them get to power in the first place? If the people want a constitutional amendment, that constitution is going to get back to the people for a referendum. This is how the system works. And if the people of Algeria want a new constitution, then it is an Algerian constitution that will be in effect, number one. Number two, the FIS has accepted, as I said, to enter the game with its rules, and it will respect it. It is bound by it. Some people are talking from a theological point of view that if they take power Islamically, they cannot relinquish it, which is false, because we should judge them in terms of their performance. If they get to power, if they don't perform well, it is not Islam that failed. It is these people who failed. And such, historically, if Muslims do not perform, Islam has failed, and this is a fact of history. Where is the Islamic Ummah? Where is the Islamic empire and all that? It failed because people did poorly. So it's not a matter of theology, it is a matter of performance. And that's what we should judge them under that standard. Okay?
I'd like to add a very quick comment on this, and that's the following. The question is by its very nature speculative. What happens if this takes place and what we should do? However, the track record speaks exactly to the opposite of this. If we look at the track record of the FIS, that first of all, its leadership very clearly indicated both in writing and in speaking that it will abide by the Algerian constitution, and moreover, it will respect the multi-party representation. Secondly, even in situations of a crisis, it's very interesting to see that the proposition by the FIS to enter, at least to try and stop the military junta from dominating the scene, is the creation of an alternative parallel parliament where they themselves proposed for people to come in on a proportional representation basis and be part of a plural parliament by its very nature. So when it comes to the implementation, we do have proof in hand that this is a policy that will be adopted by this particular party.
Kamran Mehman from the Islamic Horizons, published by the Islamic Society of North America. This is to follow up on a question that was asked earlier. I'd like to get more of a specific answer. Looking at the big picture, what direction do you see the United States heading in? The United States has always claimed to support democracy around the world, and it's always been a part of our culture. Now, however, we are turning our back on a democratic experiment because we don't like the Algerian people's democratic choice. As a result, we in the United States are being accused of favoring selective democracy, not true democracy and equality. What moral implications does this shift have for future U.S. world leadership?
Well, I think you raised a big question, and I think Professor Cantori and our colleagues to my right here have made reference to that, and that is when they quoted the Friedman article, tempering idealism with pragmatism. I think human beings live by myths and ideals. American society has been able to develop this far because of myths and ideals. The whole Jeffersonian tradition, and you're a student of American political history, you know that the traditional dichotomization between the Jeffersonian school and the Hamiltonian school, students are taught this in graduate school. The reality here really is the United States' credibility in the Muslim world and in the third world would be badly damaged if it becomes glaringly clear that democracy is practiced at home and hypocrisy is practiced abroad. But I think Professor Cantori made reference to certain realities that exist in the Muslim world, and of course that might very well explain the vacillation in terms of the statements that you get from the State Department. The initial response definitely was the response of certain elements in the US government and in certain establishments in the country who feel that, well, the Muslims don't deserve democracy. They are used to dictatorships, which is a lie, because nobody wants to be bullied or kicked around. And the second decision really is to be neutral. Here you're hedging your bets, and Professor Cantori suggests that maybe the French influence, because the French are very concerned about waves of human bodies across the Mediterranean. Remember now, Algerie is very close to France. You see the Haitians risking life across the Atlantic to come to America. And of course, when will America absorb all these tired and harried and restless refugees? It is better to keep people at home with democracy. I think what policymakers in the United States are going to see after the 1992 election is that there is going to be a very important correlationship between democracy abroad and immigration or migration of peoples to richer grounds. And those who really want, and this is where the Muslims have to emphasize, our people are not going to go to France or to Germany or to Italy or to any other country if you let us govern ourselves the way we want. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to introduce the elected president of the Muslim Youth of North America. Go ahead.
I'm representing The New Dawn, which is a publication by Muslim Youth of North America. And my question is, what do you foresee in the political future of Algeria? Would the FIS take complete control over it, or will it continue to stay in a coalition with the junta and with the other political parties?
That's a question from Inayat Shaheen. Am I correct?
I think coalition with the military junta is out of the question. Coalition with the other tendencies, yes. Living together, yes. Listening to the people, yes. But not people parachuted from nowhere to lead our people. I don't think that will take place ever. We are done with that and we are over with it. It's gone the days in which if you want a prayer room, you have to get the permission from the party. And we have gone through that and it's over with it.
Yes.
Mahmoud Kazmi from the Al-Bashir, the publication of the Muslim Youth Council. On a recent PBS News show, it was stated by a featured expert that the Islamic Party has no real programs with respect to education and economics, which are the real concerns of Algeria. It has been said that the Islamic Party's response is to simplify all problems by saying their answers are in the Quran. Do the Islamists have a real agenda, or are their answers really in the Quran?
Okay. I guess here I'm going to quote the other prominent figure that was included in the PBS program, and that is John Antelis. And I thought that his answer was very revealing. Moreover, it was very accurate. I'm going to paraphrase him rather than quote him exactly. The idea is that talking about an economic reform program that is being worked on. There are workshops that took place in Algeria. The process is going on, and in due time, we will certainly hear of the progress on this particular front. With respect to a complete program, we do not see why the FIS has to be singled out, whereas it has made as much of an effort as any other party that presented itself for the leadership of Algeria. So in that particular sense, John Antelis' argument was very accurate and very, very revealing. However, the statement that Bill Zartman made concerning the social program was a complete misnomer and a terrible stereotype. That the social program of the FIS being that of segregating schools and clustering women behind black veils, that was a terrible thing to do. Because that, first of all, academically is dishonest, because there isn't such a thing. We have never seen a writing or a statement by anything that has been released by the FIS that said or claimed such a thing. And the second thing that is very, very important is that the social program, if he were to do his homework correctly, would be one where the amount of welfare work that has been done by the FIS over the last 2 years is absolutely staggering. That people were fed, supported, helped in every respect and in every walk of life.
2 more questions, but before that, I'd like to say that the AMC has a videotape of Mr. Abbasi Madani, or correctly, Dr. Madani Abbasi, the way we say it. And we have a tape that was taped with him by an American crew here, January 91, where he talks about FIS and the future and how they would come up to do it. 2 more questions, that's it. Tfadal.
Thank you very much. شكرا جزيلا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. My question, of course, to our brothers from Algeria. I hope that the same like the Muslim Council in America did this good presentation. They themselves, the Algerians in the West in particular, will do the same thing, particularly in the surroundings of the power like United States Congress and so forth. My question, is it true that the rumors say that there is foreign power that make Ben Jadid to resign? Not he himself, not the Algerian people. Those who are against Islam, whether from the Middle East or from the West, they are the people running after killing any Islamic movement in the world.
A brief comment, if you don't mind.
Before I answer this one, just a word on the migration of Algerians across the Mediterranean. What we are looking for is a stable, prosperous Algeria, which is governed by the people, for the people. And we will be very happy to go to it rather than live in foreign lands. This is number one. With respect to foreign powers, yes, brother, there was Arab concerns. Our neighbors were concerned. Tunisia is practicing all kinds of horrible things against its population. The human rights organizations have spoken about, and as such, an Algeria-led, a peace-led Algeria is going to be a safe haven for those who are oppressed everywhere in the world, and especially in our neighbors. So that definitely does disturb them. And yes, if it's in that context, there is foreign interference.
Yes, that's our final question.
My name is Akila Rab with Al-Bashir magazine, and I'd like to know how patient do you see the Algerian people being with the new government brought about by this coup? And is there a possibility of a physical revolution if things don't change in time?
Okay. The waiting game here is not one of patience. I think a more accurate statement would be that the Algerians are still in a state of shock. That what is going on now is not the fact that people have made specific deliberate decisions to just sit and wait for things to happen. But there are two phenomena that are going on at the same time. The first one is that people are still trying to put themselves together after what happened, because it is absolutely unbelievable that such things took place, or that there are people in 1992, after the Soviet experience, that still think of solving problems through military coup d'etats, which is absolutely fascinating. The second thing about what should be done in terms of the future, time is definitely on the side of the people. And there will be absolutely no decision to move towards rushing issues to try and go into sporadic actions that will result into bloodshed and loss of innocent life. So whatever will come and whichever way it will go, we have 100% trust and confidence in the leadership that will make the right decision at the right time. And then we'll have to take it from then on, because we enter the realm of speculation and we have no facts to back it up anymore.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. I'd like to thank our panelists for coming and enlightening us. And I'd like you, of course, to come. And I'd like also to thank C-SPAN for covering this. And hopefully it will be carried around the nation, and hopefully to the Algerian peoples and others who love democracy. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you very much. Excellent. Very good. Thank you very much.
That concludes our coverage of this news conference on Algeria. For more information on the briefing, write to the American Muslim Council at 1212 New York Avenue Northwest, Suite 525 in Washington, D.C. The zip code is 20005. Coming up next, a discussion on CNN coverage of international events.
Oh, of course. I live here. Have we met before somewhere?
On September 17, 1789, delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, signed the Constitution. Some delegates, however, feared a strong central government and requested additional provisions to the Constitution to protect individual rights. So, on September 25th, only 12 days after the Constitution was signed, the Congress proposed that 12 amendments be added.
Historically, I think most scholars agree that the original Constitution as proposed in Philadelphia in 1787 would not have been ratified by the requisite number of states had it not been for the understanding in a number of key states, including Virginia and New York and Massachusetts and New Hampshire, that at a very early time there would be amendments to the Constitution, and I think most of them assumed that that would include a Bill of Rights.
On December 15, 1791, 10 amendments were ratified as the Bill of Rights. The 2 unratified amendments dealt with congressional apportionment and compensation.
When the Congress proposed amendments in the first Congress, they actually proposed 12, and the First Amendment, I think, was the third. The first 2 were not ratified by the requisite number of states, therefore never became part of the Constitution. So the First Amendment is called the First Amendment by accident, although some would say it's a happy coincidence because a lot of people would say it really is the most important. Dealing with speech, for example, a lot of people have argued that the protection of free speech is really basic. Without free speech, you don't have anything else. You have to be able to speak freely in order to exercise almost any other right.
The First Amendment also allows for the freedom of religion, the freedom of the press, the right to peaceably assemble, and the right to petition the government.
The Second Amendment, having to do with right to bear arms, a very contentious subject, but on the face of it, the text suggests that the right to bear arms is connected with the militia, that you don't have a right to bear arms that is unrelated to the militia, that if you're not doing it to further the militia, you don't have a right. There are a lot of people who argue against that, but that is, in fact, the position that the present court has taken.
The Third Amendment prohibits the quartering of soldiers. This was a reaction to the British practice of requiring some citizens to put up soldiers in their homes.
So we go from the third, which is probably the least important amendment, and really a dead letter, to the fourth, which is one of the most important, having to do with search and seizure. Now, today, most of the law on search and seizure that comes out of the Supreme Court, for example, is decided in the context of criminal cases. And for that reason, a lot of people tend to think of the Fourth Amendment as having to do only with the criminal law, as having to do only with the protection of the rights of, quote, criminals, close quote. But in point of fact, I think that's really an incorrect view of the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment, along with the Fifth, I think the Fourth and Fifth really are very similar in this respect, help to define the relationship between the government and the individual. And that's true for everybody, because everybody is to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. And if the government isn't held to this limit in the Fourth Amendment, that affects everybody. I mean, that's really, when you talk about the difference between a police state and our system of government, you're really talking a lot about the protections of the Fourth Amendment.
The Fifth Amendment protects an individual from arbitrary action by law enforcement bodies. An individual does not have to answer for a crime until presented with an indictment from a grand jury, cannot be tried twice for the same crime, and is protected against self-incrimination. The Fifth Amendment also states that the government may not take someone's property for public use without compensation. The Sixth Amendment protects persons accused of crime. The individual has the right to a speedy trial, to be informed of the nature of the accusation, to hear testimony against him, and to have an attorney.
Without counsel, really, a defendant can't do a whole lot, or most defendants can't. Sometimes they think they can, but often they're mistaken, and they don't do very well. Really, under our system of justice, you really have a trial judge, you have a prosecutor, you have a defense attorney. You need all three. If you don't have all three, you're not going to have a system of justice that works very well. So that's extremely important.
For civil cases such as lawsuits, the Seventh Amendment guarantees the right to a trial by jury. The Eighth Amendment protects the right of the accused, stating that bail cannot be set at an unreasonable amount, or excessive fines cannot be imposed. Cruel and unusual punishment is also prohibited. The Ninth Amendment forbids Congress to adopt laws that would violate the rights mentioned in the first 8 amendments. The final amendment in the Bill of Rights prohibits the government from claiming powers that are not given to it by the Constitution.
Well, it affects us every day. If you just read the paper will talk about the Supreme Court deciding cases and deciding cases that affect all of us. So it has a great practical significance for people in their everyday lives.
C-SPAN 2 and its companion network, C-SPAN, are the cable television industry's networks for public affairs programming. C-SPAN 2 is now in its 5th year providing coverage of the United States Senate and an inside look at the democratic process. If you have a question or comment, please write us at the C-SPAN Networks, 400 North Capitol Street, Suite 650, Washington, D.C. Our zip code is 20001. Just ahead on C-SPAN 2, we will bring you a discussion on cable news network coverage of international events. The program features remarks by several members of the network's international unit, including Eason Jordan, Vice President and Managing Editor of CNN's International Desk, Frank Sesno, anchor of the Washington Bureau, and Ralph Begleiter, CNN's International Affairs Correspondent. The discussion was hosted by the Washington Metropolitan Cable Club, and it took place here in the nation's capital yesterday.
If I can have your attention, we're going to get started. I want to welcome everybody to the January meeting of the Washington Cable Club. I'm John Evans, its president, and I want to welcome a new year.
But unfortunately, as I said, everybody wants the junta to rule and not democracy. Our session will start today. We will start by a briefing from each of our panelists for a few minutes, and then I will open for discussion. We will start with Dr. Luis Cantori, Professor of Political Science from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County campus. Professor Cantori.
Thank you. It gives me great pleasure to be here this morning to speak on this important subject. I want to begin by saying something further about myself. I am a Middle East specialist. I have spent 25 years now trying to understand Islam. I am not a Muslim, and I just want to say that. What I want to do is I want to talk about two factors that are involved in the effort to try to interpret the political situation in Algeria. And basically this has to do with stereotyping. The stereotyping of Islam on the one hand and the stereotyping of Arabs and democracy on the other. And I want to make an argument about the fact that this stereotyping is interfering in a very major way with, in fact, telling the story accurately and analyzing it accurately. One of the conclusions that I want to come to is the following, and that is that if we read the story, if we read the reporting that we're getting, I think it's fair to say the story is basically negative, when in fact the opposite conclusion is the one that's warranted, and that is that it's in fact quite a positive development. But what I want to argue is that the negative conclusion is a result of the stereotypes themselves. Now, this is a big subject to talk about stereotypes, but I think there's a very easy way to get into it. And that is, I think, the reoccurring word in the Western accounts of the political situation in Algeria is something called fundamentalism. And that word, the word fundamentalism is in fact a Western stereotype that really has little or nothing to do with Islam in a very important way. The word fundamentalism has come from the English language to be applied to the Arab Middle East and Islam from, in fact, Christianity. The term actually, if it has any meaning at all, it has to do with evangelical Christianity and has nothing to do with Islam. Arabs and Muslims themselves don't even use the word. There is a word, usuliyah, in Arabic, but it's not used. It's not an important a term for self-characterization. Instead, what the term becomes is a kind of broad brush concept that I would make about this, is the fact that what we have in Algeria today is provincial elections that resulted in a major political success for the face, conducted in a very fair and very regular fashion. And then we have had the first stage of parliamentary elections, which have occurred in the same way. And these kinds of elections, on the basis of this regularity and this degree of representativeness, in fact, has not occurred anywhere else in the Middle East. And that's the story. So it's not a negative story. If you're a Democrat with a small d and one wants to see democracy in the world, it's in fact a positive story. It's a wonderful accomplishment and something to be looked at in a constructive way. But the stereotype interferes, because the stereotype assumes that Muslims batter their way to power, that they fight their way to power. And all of a sudden the Western press is disappointed because the Muslims in Algeria are not doing that. They are conducting themselves according to the law and the Constitution in a democratic fashion. So what the Western press then does is say the following: well, we're kind of disappointed. You understand I'm speaking in a slightly provocative way, but the Western press is kind of disappointed because the Muslims are not behaving irrationally and in an extreme way. But the Western press also knows that democracy is incompatible with Islam. And therefore, if the Muslims are going to conduct themselves according to the law and in a constitutional way, well, what can we expect? Because if they should succeed, they will frustrate democracy, and democracy will not happen. Well, you know, at this point, we're getting very dictatorial. We're getting very judgmental about something that we have, in effect, no business being judgmental. This is an Algerian dynamic. This is an Algerian political process. It'll play itself out, I think, in a dialectical way, because there is a tradition of secularism in Algeria. There is exactly that tradition. And there is the Islamic sentiment fueled by grievances and economic disparities and non-performance on the part of the system and so forth and so on. That's an Algerian case, an Algerian situation. It's a very dramatic one. Furthermore, we need to realize, and that is the extreme discipline and order with which the FIS has conducted itself. And then if we finally come to where I understand we are right now, what we have is even a more positive story. But you see, the press is not reporting it this way. The positive story is the following. The junta has taken power, and the FIS, as the Islamic majority, but now opposition to the junta, has chosen, for the time being at least, to behave in a peaceful and a restrained way. And then what is happening is that the FLN has now joined the FIS in opposition to the junta. Hussein Ahmed, the leader of the Berber-based political opposition group, has joined with FIS. And what we have is a remarkable case of a commitment on the part of groups that really don't agree with one another to commit themselves to a democratic process. And the story is not being told that way. And I would further conclude with the observation that what we're seeing in Algeria right today, in fact, has the prospects of a real prospects of democracy. It has the real prospects of a kind of structured pluralism, in which the FLN, for example, will continue probably to argue a kind of secular point of view, but that will be representative of a certain segment of the Algerian people. And the Ahmed group will represent another kind of ethnic factor, Muslim, but also ethnic in its Berber identification. And then the FIS will represent something else. And so the story is really a remarkably positive one. And I would conclude by observing the fact that it's not told that way. It's taken to be a negative one. And I would suggest that it's a consequence of these stereotypes. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cantori. For the record, I'd like to say that as of now, I have only seen 3 specialists who would come out and talk about this the way they did. And those are Professor Cantori, Professor Antilles from New York, and Mr. Graham Fuller from the RAND Corporation. Thank you very much for clarifying the stereotypes, the issue of Islam and the Islamic movements. And yes, not only the FLN, but also the NLF, the National Liberation Front, now joined FIS into fighting the junta, as the professor said eloquently, in the most positive way, but it is yet to be reported. I would like to introduce Dr. Mohamed Lazzouni, who is also a consultant for AMC. He is a native from Algeria, and he would give us some background on Algeria and the last 4 years. Dr. Lazzouni.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. What I'd like to do for you is maybe to come with 2 major points. The first one is to put Algeria in the context of the world map.
Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, good morning. Thank you for coming for this press conference of the American Muslim Council. It is our pleasure to have you here and our distinguished panelists. My name is Abdurrahman Al-Amoudi. I am the Executive Director of the American Muslim Council here in Washington, D.C. I would like to name this press conference Algerian Democracy. We in the American Muslim Council, as in the Islamic Salvation Front in Algeria, disciplined ourselves not to have this press conference but a day after what was supposed to be the day after the second round of elections. Today we would have hoped that the Algerian people would have rejoiced on completing their 4-year struggle for democracy, for choice, and for voting in or out whoever they want to rule in Algeria. But as many predicted, and as Dr. Suleiman Young here predicted a few months ago when the American Muslim Council had their conference called Democracy and Human Rights in North Africa, and he will tell us about that, many people predicted that democracy might not live long in Algeria. The Algerian people spoke, and they said and made their choice. It is very unfortunate that the media in the West tried to stereotype the issue of democracy and Islam, not only in Algeria, but worldwide. Although the Algerian people chose their choice, like the people of Russia, like the people of the previous Soviet Union, like the people of East Europe, but unfortunately Muslim countries still don't get to go ahead with their dreams and their democracy. We even saw it in our own Department of State, where they came up with 2 statements. The first one was a negative one, the second one was a neutral one. It wasn't pro-democracy, it wasn't pro the people, but sometimes also it went far enough to find some reason, constitutional reasons, for the junta which took power in Algeria. In Algeria now, we have a new president by the name of Mohamed, who wasn't in Algeria for the last 30 years, and he is coming in to help the junta rule. We have never seen somebody coming from outside who was a warrior before. Yes, he was. He has his history, but he has been out from the country. The Algerian people struggled for this to happen.
It is used by the West when it wants to talk about political Islam in order to dismiss it. Because the term has connotations of violence, fanaticism, irrationality, and so forth and so on. And it's striking that in this particular story, the story of the National Salvation Front in Algeria, that this term is the one that is used all the time by both the French press and by the English press to characterize this movement. Because that term fundamentalism also has another connotation to it. And that is that it's a term that somehow is meant to characterize Islamic behavior at the margins. It's supposed to mean something about Islam in its extreme forms. And what we have today in Algeria is not Islam at the margins, but Islam at the center. It's a majority speaking, and it's the majority that's trying to express itself. So what the word fundamentalism becomes in journalistic terms and in policy terms, as used in American policy statements, is a term of dismissal. It means that whatever point of view, whatever political agenda that the majority of the Algerian people, as determined by one of the freest elections, in fact, that have occurred anywhere in the Middle East, has to say is not acceptable. It's very interesting because the press reporting is, after all, supposed to be objective. In fact, it's not, because it uses this particular term. The second stereotype has to do with the whole subject of democracy. And here, the stereotype is essentially the following, and that is that one cannot, quote unquote, reasonably speak about democracy in the Middle East. That's considered a kind of an oxymoron. It's a kind of a contradiction. First of all, it overlooks, that stereotype overlooks some pretty remarkable things that have happened on the subject of Islam and democracy in at least 2 countries. And that's got to do with the participation of the Muslim Brethren, or the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, in parliamentary politics in Egypt, for example. And it also overlooks the fact that the Speaker of the Parliament in Jordan is a member of an Islamic organization, and that in Jordan the Muslim organization, the Ikhwan, has in fact participated in the parliamentary process. Now, with what outcomes is another question. But the point is that we lose sight of the fact that there's already been a recent experience along these lines. But I think that the thing that's really lost sight of, and this is a kind of a conclusion to